We often imagine the ancient past as a brutish, disconnected world of mud and silence, a place where people lived in isolation and fear. Yet the truth is that their world was as interconnected, as reliant on complex networks, and as comfortable in its daily routines as our own. It is late summer, around the year 1177 BC, in the sprawling palace complex of Pylos, located in the rolling hills of modern-day Messenia, Greece. The sun is setting over the Ionian Sea, casting long golden shadows across the painted plaster floors of the Great Megaron. Scribes are busy at work, pressing their styluses into damp clay to record the final tallies of the season's yield. Thousands of jars of scented olive oil, stacked in cool, dark storerooms, waiting for export to distant lands. This is a scene of deceptive peace. It is the hum of a machine working perfectly, the sound of a civilization that believes it has conquered the chaos of nature. We recognize this feeling, the quiet satisfaction of a job done, the assumption that tomorrow will be exactly like today, unaware that the world outside is holding its breath. But how does a civilization at its absolute peak simply cease to be, vanishing into the ash of history in the span of a single generation? Let us step into the dust of the royal courtyard to witness the moment the clock stopped. The air in the citadel is thick with the scent of roasted meat and the sweet, heavy perfume of rose-scented oil, a luxury that Pylos is famous for producing. The harvest has been bountiful enough, or so the tablets say. In the lower town surrounding the stone walls, families are settling in for the evening meal. There is a comforting rhythm to life here, a predictable cycle that has held firm for centuries. The father returns from the fields or the workshops where bronze is hammered into breastplates and bowls. The mother oversees the intricate management of the household, a role that goes far beyond simple domesticity. In this age, women are the silent engine of the economy. While the kings and warriors posture in the great halls, boasting of battles and lineage, it is the women who manage the massive textile industry that funds the kingdom. In the workshops attached to the palace, hundreds of women spin and weave the flax and wool that will be dyed with royal purple and shipped to Egypt or the Levant. They are the keepers of the techniques, the masters of the loom, and without their labour, the trade routes would run dry. Tonight they rest their hands, their fingers stained with dye and rough from the wool, looking out over the olive groves that turn silver in the twilight. They feel the stone beneath their feet solid and immovable. They trust in the walls. Inside the palace archives, a scribe meticulously finishes a list. He is recording the distribution of bronze to smiths in the outlying districts. It is a mundane task, yet it reveals the incredible sophistication of this world. This bronze is not local. The copper came from the island of Cyprus, days of sailing to the east, and this tin was brought by donkey caravans from the far reaches of Afghanistan, thousands of miles away. It is a global economy, bound together by treaties, marriages, and the unspoken agreement that trade is better than war. The scribe does not know that the tin caravans have stopped moving, or that the ships from Cyprus have been burned at the waterline. He simply presses his reed into the clay, assuming that the metal will arrive as it always has, but there is a tension in the air that the stone walls cannot block out. It is a subtle shift, like the drop in pressure before a thunderstorm. The king of Pylos has sent orders to the coast, urgent commands that were etched into lead strips rather than the usual clay, hinting at a desperation that is rarely seen in official records. He has called for the Watchers of the Sea to guard the coastline. It is a vague phrase, one that historians still argue over. Was he afraid of pirates, a rival Mycenaean king, or something entirely new, a threat that had no name and no face? Down in the harbour, the fishermen are the first to notice the silence. Usually the horizon is dotted with the sails of merchant vessels, fat, round-hulled ships bringing glass from Canaan, ivory from Egypt, or amber from the Baltic. But for weeks, the horizon has been empty. The great circulatory system of the Bronze Age is failing. The heart is beating, but the blood has stopped flowing. In the courtyards, the rumours begin to circulate, whispered low so as not to frighten the children. A traveller from the north speaks of cities that are simply gone, their palaces turned to black skeletons against the sky. He speaks of a hunger that drives men to madness, of droughts that have turned the fertile plains of Anatolia into dust bowls. The locals listen, but they do not truly hear. It is human nature to believe that the disaster will always happen to someone else in some other place. They look at their granaries, which are full. They look at their walls, which are high. They look at their soldiers, whose armour shines in the torchlight. Yet there are small signs that the Golden Age is fracturing. The price of grain has doubled in the market. A few families, those with clearer sight or perhaps just more anxiety, have begun to bury their valuables under the floorboards of their homes. It is a strange, secretive ritual, wrapping a necklace of lapis lazuli or a bronze dagger in linen and hiding it in the earth, hoping to retrieve it when the trouble passes. We find these hoards today, thousands of years later, still waiting for owners who never returned. The mood in the palace shifts from administration to fuss. The frantic energy of preparation takes over. The women are no longer weaving. They are inventorying food stocks, calculating how long the citadel can survive a siege. Their role shifts from creators of wealth to guardians of survival. They count the jars of water, the sacks of barley, the dried figs. They look at their children differently now, measuring their limbs not for growth, but for stamina. Could this child walk for a day? Could they carry their own weight? It is the end of the season of plenty. The palace economy, a system where the central authority collected, stored, and redistributed everything, is about to face its ultimate test. This system relied on absolute trust. The farmer gave his grain to the palace because he trusted the palace to feed him in the winter. The soldier fought for the king because the king guaranteed the safety of his land. But when the ships stop coming and the rumours of burning cities turn into pillars of smoke on the horizon, that trust evaporates like water on hot stone. Historians still debate the precise cause of what happened next. Some blame a massive earthquake storm that shattered the walls. Others point to a climate shift that caused a famine, driving the sea peoples to migrate in search of food. But for the family huddling together in a room near the palace gates, the cause does not matter. The geopolitics of empires are irrelevant when the reality is fear. The night deepens. The torches flicker in the drafty corridors of Pylos. The scribe puts down his stylus, leaving the tablet unfinished. He will never write the final entry. Outside, the wind picks up, blowing in from the sea, carrying a scent that is not salt and not pine. It is the smell of smoke, distant but unmistakable. The comfortable normalcy, the sophisticated routine of centuries has run out of time. The decision to stay or to go is no longer a philosophical debate. It is a question of life and death. The walls that were meant to keep the danger out have now become a trap. The family looks at the door. They look at the possessions they have spent a lifetime gathering, the painted pottery, the heavy loom, the heirlooms of ancestors. They realize that the world they knew is already gone, even if the roof is still standing. The safety of the palace is an illusion. To stay is to perish, to leave is to walk into a nightmare. But as the first alarm fires are lit on the distant hills, signalling the approach of the end, the question hangs heavy in the silent room. How does one choose what to carry when the only destination is the unknown? The decision to leave is a heavy door that, once closed, cannot easily be opened again. Inside the stone dwelling, the air grows still. The first act of departure is not movement, but a profound and unnatural cessation of life, the extinguishing of the hearth. For generations, the fire in the centre of the main room has been the heartbeat of the family. It cooked the barley porridge, dried the damp wool, and kept the winter chill at bay. To pour water over the embers, hearing the hiss of steam and watching the light die into a wet grey ash, is to acknowledge that this structure is no longer a home. It is now merely a shell of stone and timber, returning slowly to the earth. The burden of packing falls squarely on the shoulders of the women. In the Bronze Age division of labour, men were often the guardians of the perimeter, the hunters, and the ploughmen, but women were the masters of the interior world. They knew the inventory of the household down to the last dried fig. Now facing the terrified urgency of flight, they must perform a heartbreaking calculation. They become the ultimate pragmatists, forced to weigh the value of the past against the possibility of a future. Imagine the scene in the dim light of the storage room. A mother stands before a lifetime of accumulated possessions. There are the painted stirrup jars, beautiful vessels imported from Crete, decorated with the tentacles of octopuses, a symbol of the sea's bounty. There are the heavy woolen cloaks she wove herself, taking months to spin the thread and work the loom. There are the toys carved from wood for the children. And there is the food, sacks of hard winter wheat, jars of honey, and skins of wine. The equation is brutal in its simplicity. Weight equals death. A donkey, if they are lucky enough to own one, can carry perhaps 200 pounds over rough terrain. A human can carry perhaps 40 or 50. Every ounce devoted to a memory is an ounce stolen from survival. We see here the hidden logic of history stripping life down to its rawest essentials. The beautiful painted pottery is set aside. It is too fragile, too heavy, and ultimately useless for the road. The heavy vertical loom, the machine that gave the woman her economic power and social standing, must be left standing in the corner. It is a surrender of identity. Without her loom, she is no longer a weaver. She is a refugee. This selection process is where we see the quiet fortitude of the ancient matriarch. She does not weep over the pottery. She is too busy calculating how many days of grain can fit into a leather sack. She prioritizes the high-calorie foods, dried meat, nuts, and barley. She packs the small bronze knife, the fire starter, and the small amulets of the household gods. These gods are small enough to be tucked into a belt pouch. Even in the collapse of civilization, the spiritual need to carry protection is considered as vital as water. There is a fascinating fringe detail that archaeologists have uncovered in the ruins of these abandoned cities: the presence of emergency hoards. Beneath the clay floors or inside hollow walls, we often find caches of bronze tools, jewellery, and precious stones. This tells us a poignant story about the mindset of these families. They did not believe they were leaving forever. They packed with the specific intent of returning. "We will hide the silver here, monsieur," they must have whispered, "and when the troubles pass, we will come back for it." This hope was the only thing that made the departure bearable. They were not abandoning their lives, they were merely pausing them. Of course, the silence of 3,000 years tells us that they never came back. Historians still argue whether these evacuations were panicked routes or organised withdrawals. In some cities, the granaries were found completely empty, swept clean, suggesting a slow and methodical packing over weeks. In others, meals were found half-cooked in pots and valuable tools were dropped in doorways, pointing to a terror that arrived within minutes. But for our family, let us assume they have the luxury of a few hours. The children are the hardest to manage. They do not understand the math of survival. A child wants to bring a favourite polished stone or a cumbersome wooden doll. The mother must gently but firmly remove these items from the pile. She replaces the toy with a small bag of seeds. This is not cruelty. It is an act of supreme love. She is looking at a horizon the child cannot see, a future where they will need to plant a garden in a strange land if they hope to see another winter. The psychological weight of these small rejections is heavier than the packs they will strap to their backs. As the piles are finalised, the house undergoes a strange transformation. Stripped of the soft textiles, the colourful jars, and the personal tokens, the rooms echo differently. They feel cold, alien. The family moves through the space like ghosts in their own lives. They put on their sturdiest sandals, wrapping the leather straps tight around their ankles. They layer on tunics, wearing their clothes instead of carrying them. The father checks the donkey's harness. The beast is nervous, sensing the anxiety of its masters. He lashes the sacks of grain to the wooden frame, balancing the load with the precision of an engineer. If the load shifts on a mountain pass, the animal could fall, and with it their food supply. Every knot is tied with a prayer. Finally, there is the moment of the threshold. The wooden door is pulled shut. There is no locking mechanism to turn, no key to pocket. In a tight-knit community, doors were rarely barred against neighbours. Now the door is closed against the void. The woman touches the doorframe one last time. It is a gesture of gratitude to the shelter that raised her children. She leaves behind the loom, the painted walls, the buried silver, and the extinguished hearth. They step out into the street. It is crowded with others doing the same, a river of silent, bowed heads moving toward the city gates. The noise of the city, the clang of smiths, the shouting of merchants, the laughter of children, has been replaced by the scuffing of leather on stone and the creaking of cartwheels. They are no longer citizens of a great palace state. They are wanderers. The structure of their lives, once defined by the rising sun and the seasonal tasks, is now defined by a single, terrifying objective: forward motion. But as they merge into the stream of humanity leaving the only world they have ever known, a daunting question rises with the dust of the road. Once the walls of the city are behind them, what protection remains against a world that has suddenly lost its rules? The procession of families moves slowly, a sluggish current of humanity channeled toward the single exit that defines their world, the Great Gate. In the Bronze Age, the city gate was never merely a hole in a wall. It was a statement of absolute power, a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. As our family approaches this threshold, they pass beneath the shadow of what historians call Cyclopean masonry. These are blocks of limestone so colossal, so impossibly heavy, that later generations of Greeks would look upon the ruins and whisper that only the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of myth, could have lifted them. To the modern eye, a wall is a boundary, but to the ancient mind, the city wall was the ribcage of the god that protected them. Inside was Themis, divine order, law and safety. Outside was chaos, the domain of wild beasts and lawless men. Walking through this archway is not just a change of location, it is a spiritual traverse. It is the voluntary surrender of the protection of the state. As the mother walks behind the donkey, keeping a hand on its flank to steady it, she looks up at the towering jambs of the gate. She notices things she never had time to see when she was rushing to the market. She sees the deep, polished grooves worn into the stone threshold, scars left by centuries of chariot wheels entering and exiting in triumph. She sees the heavy timber doors, reinforced with bronze bands, now standing uselessly open. There is a fascinating fringe detail regarding these gates that adds a layer of tragic irony to the scene. Archaeologists have discovered that in times of crisis, the ancients often performed desperate rituals at these thresholds. We find evidence of oil poured into the earth, or small clay idols buried beneath the flagstones at the very moment of destruction. These were last-ditch appeals to the gods of the liminal spaces, the guardians of the door, begging them to hold the line when the armies failed. As our family steps over the threshold, they are likely walking over these freshly buried prayers, unaware that the gods have already remained silent. The crowd compresses as it enters the tunnel of the gatehouse. The air here is cooler, smelling of damp stone and the sweat of 1,000 frightened people. The acoustic landscape shifts. The open air is replaced by the hollow, shuffling echo of sandals on pavement. In this confined space, the social hierarchy that defined their lives for centuries begins to dissolve. Scholarly debate still rages regarding the timeline of abandonment. Did the kings and the elite flee weeks ago, taking the gold and the chariots, leaving the commoners to clog the gates? Or was the collapse so sudden, so total, that prince and pauper were thrown together in the same desperate crush? Looking at the faces in the gloom of the archway, we see a mixture that suggests the latter. Here is a merchant, his robes dusted with travel grime, walking beside a bricklayer. The collapse of the Bronze Age was the great leveller. In the shadow of the gate there is no rank, only the shared currency of survival. The woman feels a wave of vertigo as she passes the midpoint of the arch. This gate was the limit of her world. Inside she was a respected weaver, a mother, a member of a community. She knew the rules. If someone stole her grain, there was a magistrate. If she fell ill, there was a temple healer. Passing this point, she becomes something else, something with no name and no rights. She is stripped of her citizenship. She glances at the relief carved above the gate, perhaps 2 lions facing a pillar, or a sphinx staring down with stony indifference. These symbols were meant to roar power to the enemies approaching from the outside. Now they seem to mock the people fleeing from the inside. They were built to keep invaders out, not to keep the citizens in. The architecture of the Bronze Age was designed for strength, for permanence, for projecting invincibility. It was not designed for exit. Then the light changes. They step out from the shadow of the arch and into the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. The transition is physical. The paved ramp of the citadel gives way to the hard-packed dirt of the wagon road. The wind hits them instantly. It is wilder here, unchecked by the winding streets of the lower town. The father pauses for a second, shading his eyes. He is looking for threats, scanning the ridgeline for bandits or the dust of an approaching army. His focus is tactical, but the mother turns back. This is the Lot's wife moment that echoes through every migration story in human history. She looks back at the walls rising sheer from the rock. From this angle, the palace looks mighty, unassailable. It glitters in the sun. It seems impossible that such a thing could fail. This is the cruelty of historical collapse. The buildings remain perfect even as the society rots. The walls of Mycenae, of Hattusa, of Ugarit. They didn't crumble the day the people left. They stood tall, guarding empty rooms and silent courtyards. The woman realizes that the city isn't dying because the walls fell. It is dying because the human spirit that animated it has walked out the gate. She sees the smoke rising from the lower town, perhaps a granary on fire, perhaps a house abandoned with the hearth still burning. She tightens her grip on her child's hand. The child is looking at a butterfly flitting over a thistle, unaware that they have just crossed the line between history and oblivion. The mother gently pulls the child forward. There is no time for nostalgia. The crowd is pushing from behind, a silent, urgent pressure. To linger is to be trampled. They begin the descent down the winding road that leads away from the Acropolis. The sounds of the city, the specific comforting hum of civilization fade with every step. They are replaced by the sound of the wind in the dry grass and the crunch of stones underfoot. The landscape opens up, vast, indifferent, and terrifyingly empty. They are now in the no man's land. In the Bronze Age, the safety of a person was measured in the radius of a day's walk from the city walls. Beyond that, you were in the realm of the outlaw and the wolf. As the sun begins to dip lower, stretching the shadows of the travellers into long, thin shapes on the road, the reality of their exposure sets in. They have no roof, they have no walls, they have only the clothes on their backs and the fragile trust they hold in one another. The fortress, with its deep wells and thick stores of grain, is now a silhouette behind them, a dark tooth biting into the sky. They are walking into a world where the rules of civilization, the contracts, the protections, the predictability, have evaporated. But as the cold evening air settles over the exposed column of refugees, a chilling realization begins to take root in the minds of the parents. Without the thick stone walls to shield them, how long can the soft, vulnerable machinery of the human body survive against the unyielding brutality of the wild? The romance of the open road is a modern invention, born from the luxury of paved highways and reliable vehicles. For the refugee of the Bronze Age, the road is an adversary, a relentless, physical punisher that begins its assault the moment the city walls disappear from view. As our family moves deeper into the hinterlands, the landscape transforms from a backdrop into a weapon. We must remember that the people of the palace culture were accustomed to a level of comfort that, while primitive to us, was luxurious for its time. They walked on smooth plaster floors, sat on polished wooden benches, and slept on raised beds filled with wool. Now, their reality is the unforgiving geometry of the wild. The terrain of Greece and the Eastern Mediterranean is beautiful but brutal, sharp limestone ridges, tangled scrub brush, and sudden, steep ravines. The first casualty of the journey is footwear. We tend to overlook shoes in history, yet they are the tires of the human machine. The standard sandal of the time is a simple affair, a sole of thick leather or woven papyrus held by straps. It was designed for the flat surfaces of the citadel, or the beaten earth of a field, not for a forced march over jagged scree. By the second day, the leather straps begin to chafe and snap. The soles wear thin, allowing every sharp stone to bruise the arch of the foot. Here, the role of the women shifts again, from packer to field medic. At every rest stop, it is the mothers who inspect the feet of the children and the elders. They use strips of linen torn from their own spare tunics to bind blisters and wrap cracked heels. They apply salves of sheep fat and beeswax, carried in small alabaster pots, a fringe detail of hygiene often overlooked. This grease was meant for cosmetics, to make skin shine in the torchlight of a banquet. Now it is the only barrier against infection. If a foot becomes infected here, miles from a clean water source or a physician, it can mean death as surely as a spear thrust. The hidden logic of survival dictates that mobility is life, to limp is to be left behind. As they walk, they follow the remnants of the imperial infrastructure. The Mycenaeans were master engineers, famous for their road networks. They built massive culverts and stone bridges so sturdy that some are still in use today, 3,000 years later. These roads were the arteries of the empire, designed to move chariots rapidly from the palace to the coast. However, historians still debate the true function and state of these roads during the collapse. Were they public highways maintained for the common good, or were they strictly military corridors forbidden to the peasantry? As the refugees trudge along these paved tracks, they likely feel exposed. A road that carries a chariot can also carry an invading army. Thus they face a terrible choice. Stay on the road and risk being spotted by the others, bandits, mercenaries, or desperate mobs, or veer into the brush and fight the terrain. Most choose the brush. They move parallel to the road, keeping the stone track in sight but staying hidden in the olive groves and pine forests. This slows their pace to a crawl, the undergrowth tears at their clothes. The sun beats down with a violence they never felt under the shaded porticos of the palace. Dehydration begins to set in, a silent, creeping lethargy that dulls the mind. As night falls, the true terror of the Bronze Age wilderness reveals itself, the darkness. We have forgotten what the true darkness looks like. In our world, light pollution turns the night sky into a dull grey. But for them, when the sun vanishes behind the mountains, the world is swallowed by an absolute suffocating blackness. They dare not light a fire. A fire is a beacon to every predator, human and animal. So they huddle together in the lee of a rocky outcrop, sharing body heat. The temperature drops rapidly in the Mediterranean hills. The sweat of the day turns cold on their skin, bringing shivering fits that exhaust their remaining energy. And then, the sounds begin. This is where the modern imagination often fails to grasp the reality of ancient Greece. We think of it as the tame land of sheep and goats, but in the 13th century BC, the wilderness was still the domain of the lion. The Nemean lion of the Hercules myth was not just a fairy tale, it was a cultural memory of a very real threat. Asiatic lions roamed the Balkans and the Near East, stalking the edges of civilization. As the cities empty and the fires go out, the animals grow bolder. The refugees hear the coughing roar of a predator in the distance, a sound that vibrates in the chest. The father grips his spear, a bronze tip on an ash shaft. It is a weapon of war designed to pierce a shield, but against a stalking lion in the dark it feels pitifully inadequate. He sits facing the dark, eyes straining, adrenaline keeping him awake despite his exhaustion. He's realizing the fragility of his species. Inside the walls, humans were the masters of the earth. Out here, they are slow, soft-skinned prey with dull senses. The women, meanwhile, create a psychological wall. They hum low, rhythmic tunes to the children, songs that have no words, just a vibration to drown out the snapping of twigs in the dark. They create a microclimate of safety with their bodies, sandwiching the young in the centre of the huddle. This is not passive waiting. It is an active defence of the group's morale. If panic takes root in the dark, the group will fracture by morning. There is a grim discovery that often happens on these roads, a moment that hardens the survivors. They come across the remains of a cart that broke an axle, or a donkey that went lame. The wreckage is stripped bare. Every scrap of leather, every grain of wheat, every piece of wood has been taken. It is a message written in debris. Charity has evaporated. The social contract that bound the village together, the obligation to help a neighbour in distress, does not extend to the open road. Out here, a broken axle is a death sentence, and the possessions of the fallen are simply resources for the living. In this environment, the civilized mind begins to crack. The complex etiquette of the palace, who bows to whom, which fork to use, how to address a priest, is shed like a snake's skin. It is replaced by a primal calculus. The refugees begin to look at the landscape not for its beauty, but for its utility. A cave is not a scenic wonder, it is a defensible shelter. A heavy stick is not firewood, it is a club. As the dawn breaks, grey and cold, the family rises stiff and aching. They have survived the first night, but the cost is visible on their faces. The softness of the city is gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed vigilance. They eat a handful of dry barley, chewing slowly to generate saliva. The luxury of cooked food is a memory. They strap their packs back on. The leather cuts into fresh bruises. They step back onto the game trail, their movements less erratic, more efficient. They are learning. But as the sun climbs higher, baking the moisture out of the air and the earth, a new and far more urgent crisis begins to overshadow the fear of lions or bandits. They check the skin bladders hanging from the donkey's flank, feeling the lightness of them, the ominous sloshing that tells them the supply is running low. The road stretches on, winding through a landscape of dry limestone and dusty scrub, and the question that now dominates every thought is not about where they are going, but simply, in this land of rock and sun, where will they find the lifeblood that the dry earth seems to have swallowed whole? Thirst is a patient hunter. Hunger can be ignored for days, a dull ache that eventually fades into lethargy, but thirst is an active, screaming panic that rises from the throat to the mind. By the third day of the migration, the geography of the refugees' world is no longer defined by the mountains or valleys, but solely by the distance between drops of water. The grand political map of the Bronze Age, the borders between the Hittites, the Mycenaeans and the Egyptians, has dissolved. It has been replaced by a primal map of springs, cisterns, and dried riverbeds. The landscape of Greece and the Aegean does not give up its secrets easily. It is a land of cast limestone, a porous rock that swallows rain as soon as it falls, funneling it deep into underground caverns where it flows in darkness, unreachable to those walking on the surface. In the palaces, water was a conquered element. It flowed through terracotta pipes, engineered by the best minds of the time, splashing into stone basins in the courtyards. It was an aesthetic object, a thing of beauty. Now, out on the sheep trails, water is the only currency that matters. Here, The specialized knowledge of the women becomes the difference between life and death. In the city, the fetching of water was often a social ritual, a time for women to gather at the fountain house and share news. But that daily rhythm ingrained in them a deep sensory understanding of water's behaviour that the men, focused on the abstract logistics of war or trade, often lacked. Watch the mother as the column halts in a dusty ravine. The men look at the horizon, scanning for danger. The woman looks at the ground. She scans the vegetation with a botanist's eye. She is looking for the dark, glossy green of an oleander bush or the broad, pale leaf of a plane tree. She knows that these plants are the liars of the landscape. They can survive with very little moisture, but they also mark the ghosts of old rivers. If there is water to be found, it will be near their roots. There is a fascinating fringe theory that suggests refugees in this era relied on dew ponds, shallow clay-lined depressions made on high ridges to catch the condensation of the night mist. While we cannot be certain our family used this exact method, we see the mother practicing a similar micro-survival skill. She instructs the children to lick the dew from the smooth stones at dawn before the sun burns it off. It is a pitiful amount of moisture, barely a thimbleful, but it wets the tongue and cracks the glue of thirst that seals the mouth shut during the night. The search is made harder by a phenomenon that historians and climatologists are still debating fiercely: the mega-drought. For decades, scholars argued that the collapse was purely political, war, rebellion, or trade failure. But recent studies of ancient pollen trapped in the mud of Mediterranean lakes tell a different, drier story. They suggest that around 1177 BC, the region was hit by a climate shift so severe it lasted for centuries. The rain simply stopped. The breadbasket regions withered. This means our family is likely walking through a landscape that is already dying. They pass village wells that have been dry for a generation. The stone lips worn smooth by ropes, but the shafts filled with dust. The disappointment of reaching a known well and finding it empty is a psychological blow that brings grown men to their knees. It is not just the lack of water, it is the betrayal of the earth itself. When they finally do find a source, perhaps a trickle seeping from a crack in a cliff face, feeding a small muddy pool, the scene stripped away the last veneer of civilized behaviour. The instinct is to rush forward, to plunge faces into the water and drink until the stomach cramps. But here, the discipline of the group saves them. The elders hold the young men back. They know that to muddy the water is to ruin it for everyone. They approach the spring with religious reverence. The water is ladled out in small cups, rationed with a strictness that seems cruel. The animals drink last, despite their suffering. This hierarchy is essential. If the donkey dies, they lose their supplies. If the father dies, they lose their protection. But if the water is fouled, they all die. There is a hidden danger in these watering holes, one that the ancients knew well. Standing water in a drying land is a trap. It attracts not just deer and boar, but things too small to see. The water in the stagnant pool is often alive with parasites. We know from skeletal remains of this period that many people suffered from debilitating infections, brucellosis, malaria, and waterborne worms. The mother, drawing on the folk wisdom passed down through generations, might strain the water through layers of linen cloth, or perhaps drop a piece of charcoal into the vessel, a primitive filtration method that surely saved countless lives without anyone understanding the chemistry behind it. As the sun sets, casting long purple shadows across the parched hills, the family fills their skin bladders. The sloshing sound is the most beautiful music they have ever heard. It is the sound of another day of life secured. They camp near the water, but not at the water. They move upwind, hiding in the rocks. They know that they are not the only ones thirsty. The water source is a magnet. In a world of scarcity, a spring is no longer a shared resource, it is a strategic asset. As they settle in for the night, watching the moon rise over the jagged silhouette of the mountains, the father does not sleep. He listens. He hears the snap of a twig, the soft whinny of a horse in the distance, the murmur of strange voices carried on the wind. They have solved the crisis of the body, but in doing so they have invited a new crisis of the spirit. The realization hits them in the dark. They are not alone in this wilderness. Other families, other tribes, perhaps even the very raiders who burned the cities are drawn to the same lifeline. The spring that sustains them is also the bait that draws their competition. And so, as the relief of hydration fades, a cold question settles over the camp. When the desperate meet the desperate in the lawless dark, does the shared need for water create a bond of brotherhood, or does it spark the violent fury of survival? As the family moves deeper into the unclaimed spaces between the fallen cities, the nature of their fear undergoes a subtle, chemical change. In the first days, the enemy was the landscape, the blistering sun, the sharp stones, the lack of water. But as they converge upon the few remaining routes that promise survival, the enemy gains a face. They are no longer walking through an empty world, they are entering a crowded corridor of desperation. In the high era of the Bronze Age, the Mediterranean was knit together by a concept the Greeks called xenia, or guest friendship. It was a sacred golden rule. If a stranger appeared at your door, you did not ask his name or his business until you had bathed him, fed him, and offered him a bed. This was not merely politeness, it was a divine mandate, overseen by Zeus himself. It was the glue of civilization, allowing merchants and messengers to travel from Mycenae to Egypt without fear. But out here on the dusty track, xenia is dead. The collapse has shattered the social contract. When a silhouette appears on the ridgeline, or the dust of another group rises in the valley below, the reaction is not welcome. It is a primal, metallic taste of adrenaline in the back of the throat. The father does not prepare a greeting, he unslings his shield. The mother does not prepare food, she gathers the children behind the bulk of the donkey, silencing them with a sharp, terrifying look that they understand instantly. The encounter usually happens in the Narrows, a mountain pass or a choke point near a river crossing. Imagine the scene, two families, or perhaps a family meeting a band of men freezing in the shimmering heat. The distance between them is perhaps 50 paces. It is close enough to see the patches on their tunics, the desperation in their eyes, and the weapons in their hands. This is where we see the sudden proliferation of a specific technological terror. Historians and archaeologists have noted a shift in weaponry during this period, marked by the rapid spread of the now two-sword. Unlike the older, brittle rapiers designed for dueling champions, these were heavy leaf-shaped bronze blades designed for slashing. They were brutal, efficient tools for mass warfare and close-quarters butchery. Seeing such a blade hanging from a stranger's belt signals that the rules of engagement have changed. This is no longer a world of heroic duels, it is a world of ugly, hacking survival. The tension in these standoffs is thick enough to choke on. The men step forward, posturing, trying to look larger, more dangerous than they feel. They shout challenges, but here lies another tragedy of the collapse, the language barrier. The Bronze Age was a polyglot world. A dozen languages, Mycenaean Greek, Luwian, Akkadian, Hurrian, were spoken across the region. In the chaos of migration, these tongues collide. The stranger shouting at you might be warning you of a fire ahead or threatening to kill you for your donkey. You cannot know. You hear only the harsh, guttural sounds of a foreign dialect, and in the absence of understanding, the mind fills in the gaps with fear. Yet in these moments of high friction, it is often the women who act as the unseen diplomats of the trail. While the men are locked in a stare-down calculating the geometry of violence, the women are performing a different assessment. They are looking at the other group's pack animals. Are they laden with household goods, or are they light and fast? They look at the footwear. Is it worn family gear, or the strapped greaves of a warrior? Most importantly, they look for children. The presence of a child is the universal flag of the refugee. It signals that the group is burdened, slow, and likely trying to avoid conflict just as much as you are. We can imagine a subtle exchange of glances between the matriarchs of these opposing groups, a momentary silent recognition of shared burden that lowers the temperature of the standoff just enough to prevent bloodshed. It is a fragile peace born not of trust but of mutual vulnerability. There is a fringe historical detail that adds a layer of complexity to these encounters, the emergence of hack-silber. As the complex credit systems of the palaces evaporated, people needed a way to trade on the road. They began taking their beautiful jewellery, intricate silver necklaces, gold armbands, and hacking them into crude chunks of metal. They carried these scraps in small pouches. If the groups decide not to fight, they might trade. A chunk of a grandmother's silver heirloom is weighed in a shaking hand and swapped for a sack of mouldy grain. It is the ultimate degradation of art into currency, the erasure of culture for the sake of a meal. Scholars still debate the true identity of the various groups moving across the landscape during this period. Egyptian inscriptions famously describe the Sea Peoples, a coalition of tribes with exotic names like the Palese, the Jekka, and the Shurden sweeping down like a plague. For decades, historians viewed them as a unified, invading army, but modern consensus is shifting toward a more nuanced, tragic view. Many now believe the invaders were actually a chaotic mix of refugees, mercenaries, and displaced farmers, people very much like our family, who are forced into violence by starvation. To the family on the road, these distinctions are meaningless. They do not care if the group blocking the path is a Shurden warband or a starving family from Anatolia. They care only about the threat. The other is a mirror reflecting their own desperate potential. If our family runs out of food tomorrow, will they become the bandits they fear today? The line between victim and aggressor is terrifyingly thin. The groups pass each other, giving a wide berth, backs pressed against the rocks. The silence is heavy, broken only by the scrape of hooves and the rustle of dry grass. Eyes remain locked until the very last moment. There is no waving, no wishing of luck. To acknowledge the other is to acknowledge the horror of the situation. They pass like ghosts, two tragic trajectories intersecting for a moment in the vast indifference of history. As the strangers disappear around the bend, the adrenaline crashes, leaving the family trembling and exhausted. The father checks the loads again, his hand shaking. The mother checks the children, pulling them closer. They have survived the encounter, but something has been lost. The world feels smaller, sharper, and more hostile. They realize now that the wilderness is not empty. It is teeming with the flotsam of a broken world. Every dust cloud on the horizon, every flock of birds startled from the brush is a signal that sends a jolt of panic through their veins. The isolation of the mountains, which once felt lonely, now feels like a sanctuary they are desperate to reach. But as they hurry forward, driven by the fear of who might be following them, the geography begins to change. The air grows heavy and humid. The smell of pine and dust gives way to a new briny scent carried on the wind. The mountains are ending. They are descending toward the great blue boundary that has defined the edge of their world for centuries. But as the glittering expanse of the sea comes into view, promising escape and freedom, they must ask themselves, in a time when the oceans themselves have become highways for war, is the coast a gateway to salvation, or have they just walked into the mouth of the trap? The descent from the highlands to the coast is usually a journey of relief, a movement from the harsh, thin air of the peaks down to the soft, rhythmic breathing of the tide. But for the refugees of the collapse, the coastline offers no solace. As the family crests the final ridge, looking down at the natural harbour that once served as a lung for the empire, they do not see the orderly bustle of commerce. They see a scene of paralysis and panic. The harbour, once a masterpiece of Bronze Age logistics, is choking. In better times, this bay would be a forest of masts. Ships from Byblos and Ugarit would be docked at the stone quays, unloading jars of Canaanite wine and taking on cargoes of perfumed oil. The air would smell of cedar, tar and spices. Today the air smells of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, and the acrid, oily smoke of burning hulls. The sea was the internet of the ancient world, the superhighway that connected cultures, spread ideas, and moved the massive quantities of grain and metal that kept the palaces alive. When the sea routes broke, the civilization starved. We are witnessing the moment when the blue highway became a dead end. The family pushes their way onto the docks, the donkeys skittish on the wooden planking. The noise is deafening, a cacophony of shouting, weeping, and the splintering of wood. The desperate hope was that a ship would be waiting, a vessel to take them to Egypt, to Cyprus, to anywhere that isn't here. But the ships are gone, or they are broken. We see here a specific tragic breakdown of technology. The great merchant ships of the Bronze Age were marvels of engineering, built with mortise and tenon joints, planks locked together like puzzle pieces, requiring constant maintenance and skilled crews to remain watertight. Without the support of the palace shipwrights, these vessels are rotting at their moorings. The few that are seaworthy are being swarmed. There is a brutal Darwinism at play on the pier. A captain of a small coastal trader stands on the deck of his ship, wielding a club to beat back the desperate fathers trying to lift their children onto the gunwales. He is shouting that he is full, that the waterline is already dangerously low. He demands payment not in grain or promises, but in gold and women. The inflation of the apocalypse has made human life cheap and passage infinitely expensive. In the chaos, we spot a fascinating fringe detail that speaks volumes about the economic crash. Piled on the dock, ignored and kicked aside by the fleeing mob, are stacks of oxhide ingots. These are heavy slab-like castings of pure copper, shaped like stretched animal skins, each weighing about 60 pounds. A month ago, a single one of these ingots could have bought a farm, a flock of sheep, or a year of luxury. They were the premier currency of international trade. Now they are essentially trash. You cannot eat copper. You cannot drink it. In the face of survival, the abstract value of money has evaporated, leaving only the raw utility of the object. The metal is too heavy to carry, so it is left to tarnish in the salt spray, a fortune abandoned because it is heavier than a sack of barley. Historians and archaeologists are still locked in a fierce debate about the destruction of these coastal cities. Did the mysterious sea peoples sail into the harbour and burn the city to the waterline? Or is the truth more complex? Some evidence suggests that the locals themselves may have torched the ports, a scorched earth policy to deny resources to the incoming raiders. Other theories propose that unpaid mercenaries, the very men hired to protect the harbour, turned on their masters when the grain shipments stopped. As our family watches, a small fishing boat, overloaded with 24 people, pushes off from the jetty. It wobbles precariously. 50 yards out, a fight breaks out on board, perhaps a shift in weight, a panic. The boat capsizes in slow motion. The screams are swallowed by the surf. There are no lifeguards, no rescue skiffs. The sea is indifferent. The watchers on the dock turn away, their faces masks of stony horror. They realise the ocean is not an escape route. It is a liquid wall. The mother pulls her children back from the edge of the wharf. She looks at the horizon. It is not empty. There are sails out there, but they are not the round-bellied merchant ships of old. They are the low, predatory profiles of galleys, the ships of the raiders. The watchers of the sea mentioned in the Pylos tablets were right to be afraid. The enemy is coming from the water. This realization forces a terrifying pivot. They cannot go back to the mountains. There is no food there. They cannot go forward into the sea. There is death there. They must move laterally. They must join the growing river of people moving along the coastal road, heading south and east, towards the only place that rumour says is still standing, the land of the pharaohs. They leave the harbour behind. As they walk past the warehouses, they see the great pithoi, storage jars as big as men, smashed open, their contents looted. The ground is slick with spilled oil and wine, a slurry of wasted calories. The waste is almost more painful to witness than the violence. It is the death of order. The road now follows the curve of the coastline. The sea is always on their right, a beautiful, glittering threat. The salt air crusts their skin and stings their cracked lips, but they are no longer walking alone. The trickle of refugees from the city has merged with other streams from the interior, forming a massive, sluggish column of humanity. They are becoming something new. They are no longer citizens of Pylos or Mycenae. They are a mobile nation, a civilization without a zip code. The distinctions of the past, rich versus poor, noble versus commoner, are being ground down by the dust of the road. But as the sun sets over the water, turning the waves the colour of wine, a new question arises from the sheer scale of this migration. When thousands of strangers are forced to walk together, sleeping side by side in the ditch, eating from the same dwindling supplies, the old laws of the city no longer apply. So in this moving chaos, what new and fragile rules will emerge to keep them from tearing each other apart before they ever reach the safety they seek? As days bleed into weeks, the column of refugees undergoes a remarkable transformation. It ceases to be a panicked mob and begins to harden into something stranger and far more resilient, a floating village. Historians often depict the collapse as a descent into anarchy, but the human animal has a profound, almost biological aversion to chaos. When the palace walls vanished, the people did not simply disperse like dust. They rebuilt the walls, not out of stone, but out of relationships, proximity, and shared rhythm. We are witnessing the birth of a mobile society. The sheer scale of the migration force's structure. A column of 10,000 people cannot move without rules. If they block the road, they starve. If they separate, they die. So a new organic order emerges from the dust, a meritocracy of the road that is far more ruthless and pragmatic than the rigid hierarchies of the old citadel. In the palace, status was determined by birth. You were a noble because your father was a noble. On the road, status is determined by utility. The scribe who can recite the lineage of the gods is now less valuable than the wheelwright who can fix a cracked axle in 10 minutes. The priest who can interpret the flight of birds takes a backseat to the herdsman who can sniff out a wolf pack before it strikes. We see the big men of anthropology emerging, leaders chosen not by divine right, but by their ability to keep the group alive for one more day. At night, this floating village enacts a defensive ritual that predates the stone cities. The circle. As the sun sets, the families do not scatter. They pull their carts and donkeys into a tight perimeter, facing outward. It is the ancestor of the pioneer wagon fort, a strategy as old as migration itself. Inside this circle, a temporary microclimate of civilization forms. Fires are lit, not just for warmth, but for the psychological comfort of light. Here, in the flickering glow, the soft infrastructure of the refugee camp comes alive, and it is almost entirely engineered by the women. While the men stand guard at the perimeter, staring into the dark, the women weave the social fabric that prevents the group from fracturing. They establish the law of the fire. If a family has run out of embers, a neighbour shares theirs without question. If a mother is sick, another woman nurses her child. This is not merely charity, it is a complex social insurance policy. By helping a neighbour today, you purchase their help for tomorrow. The women effectively create a credit system to replace the palace economy, but the currency is no longer grain or gold, it is obligation. They are the diplomats of the campfire, smoothing over the inevitable frictions that arise when exhausted, terrified people are forced to live cheek by jowl. There is a quirky linguistic detail that linguists and historians wrestle with: the birth of road pigeons. The column is a polyglot mess. Mycenaean Greeks walking beside Luwians, perhaps joined by runaway slaves speaking Levantine dialects. Over weeks of travel, a strange hybrid language begins to bubble up. Simple functional words for water, danger, trade and stop are stripped of their grammatical complexity and shared across the firelight. We are hearing the rough, chaotic sounds of a new culture being forged in real time. Scholarly debate continues regarding the absorption theory. Did these massive refugee columns destroy the villages they passed, like a swarm of locusts, or did they absorb them? Recent evidence suggests a more nuanced reality. It is likely that isolated farmers, seeing the dust cloud of 10,000 souls approaching, realized that resistance was suicide and staying behind was isolation. So they simply packed their bags and joined the parade. The invading army was actually a rolling snowball, gathering mass and diversity with every mile it covered. Inside the circle, a primitive justice system re-emerges. In the city, you went to the magistrate to settle a dispute. Here, disputes must be settled instantly, or blood will flow. We can imagine the elders of the evening, a grey-bearded blacksmith, a matriarch from a noble house, a tough mercenary captain, sitting on stones to hear grievances. He stole my sandal, she took my water skin. The judgments are quick, harsh, and final. There are no prisons on the road. The ultimate punishment is not a fine or a jail cell, it is banishment. To be cast out of the circle is to be given to the wolves. This threat alone keeps the peace. Commerce too finds a way, the floating market opens every evening. But without standard weights and measures, trade reverts to the visceral assessment of need. A bronze dagger is swapped for a sack of dried figs. A pair of sturdy boots is worth more than a gold ring. We see the total inversion of value. The luxury goods that defined the Bronze Age elite are now just dead weight, slowly filtering down to the bottom of the packs or being traded for the raw fuel of survival. Yet amidst this grit, there are flashes of profound humanity. A storyteller, perhaps a former bard of the palace, sits by the fire. He does not sing of the king's victories anymore. He sings of the journey. He sings of the Odyssey, not the polished poem of Homer that we know, but the raw, jagged oral tradition that is being written in the footsteps of the audience. He turns their suffering into a story, giving it meaning. The children listen wide-eyed, and for a moment the fear recedes. The family has found a place in this moving nation. The father has joined the perimeter guard. The mother has found a group of women who share the task of grinding grain. They are no longer alone. They are part of a tribe of the displaced. But this density of human bodies, while providing safety from bandits, creates a new and invisible danger. In the city, waste was washed away by drains. On the road, hygiene is a forgotten luxury. As they walk the same path as thousands of others, breathing the same dust, drinking from the same muddied streams, the floating village becomes a breeding ground for an enemy that no bronze sword can fight. As the sound of coughing begins to ripple through the camp, louder than the braying of the donkeys, the leaders of the circle realize that their greatest threat is not the soldiers behind them or the mountains ahead. It is the microscopic killer travelling in their own blood. The question now becomes, when the fever strikes and there are no temples or doctors to call upon, who among them possesses the old, wild knowledge to keep the death at bay? As the refugee column lengthens and the heat of the season intensifies, the greatest enemy is no longer the lion or the bandit, but the invisible microbe. In the close quarters of the camp, where thousands share the same air and the same muddied water, Disease spreads with the speed of a grass fire. Dysentery, typhoid, and infected wounds become the daily reality. It is here, in the shadow of sickness, that the social hierarchy undergoes its most profound inversion. In the palaces of Pylos and Hattusa, medicine was often the domain of male priests and scribes. They practiced a high-minded, bureaucratic form of healing, reading omens from sheep livers and reciting incantations from clay tablets. It was a medicine of ritual and authority. But out on the road, the gods are silent, and the clay tablets are heavy, useless stones. When a child is burning with fever, an incantation is not enough. The abstraction of official medicine collapses, leaving a vacuum that is immediately and capably filled by the practical, empirical knowledge of women. This is the hidden history of the Bronze Age survival. While the men look outward to defend the perimeter, the women look downward to the earth, scanning the scrub for the green shapes of salvation. We are witnessing the mobilization of an ancient oral tradition of ethnobotany, a science passed from mother to daughter for millennia, often whispering beneath the notice of the royal scribes. Watch the mother as she moves away from the camp at twilight. To the untrained eye, she is merely gathering firewood. In reality, she is visiting a pharmacy. She knows that the bark of the willow tree, when stripped and boiled, produces a bitter tea that cools a fever and dulls the ache of joints, a primitive form of aspirin that predates modern pharmacology by 3,000 years. She knows that the grey-green leaves of sage can be pressed into a paste to clean a wound, and that honey, if she has saved a precious jar, acts as a potent antibiotic, sealing a cut from the air and preventing the rot that leads to gangrene. There is a mainstream historical fact that often surprises us: the widespread use of the opium poppy in the ancient Mediterranean. Archaeologists have found poppy capsules carved into the crowns of goddesses in Crete and actual seeds in the ruins of households. In the refugee camp, the poppy is not a recreational vice, it is a mercy. The women harvest the latex from the pod, creating a strong sedative. When a man has a broken leg set without anesthesia, or a child is coughing too hard to sleep, the tears of the poppy are the only mercy available. The administration of this potent drug is strictly controlled by the matriarchs, a responsibility of life and death. Scholars still debate the extent of this female medical authority. Some argue that the famous witch figures of later Greek mythology, Medea, Circe, are actually distorted memories of these Bronze Age healers. As the male-dominated city-states re-emerged centuries later, this independent female power over life and death may have been vilified and feared. But on the road in 1177 BC, these women are not witches, they are the pillars of stability. Beyond the herbs, there is the crucial, unglamorous discipline of hygiene. We often assume ancient people were filthy, but the Minoans and Mycenaeans had elaborate bathing cultures. The women fight a desperate rearguard action against the squalor of the road. They are the ones who insist on boiling water when fuel is scarce, a practice that kills parasites even if they don't understand the germ theory behind it. They enforce the separation of latrine areas from sleeping areas. These small, nagging rules, often dismissed by the exhausted men, are the only firewall against a cholera outbreak that could wipe out the entire floating village in a week. We find a quirky, somewhat gruesome fringe detail in the medical practices of the era involving biological dressings. There is evidence to suggest the use of spider webs to clot bleeding, or even the use of mouldy bread pressed onto infected wounds. While it sounds repulsive to modern ears, the mould on the bread could contain trace amounts of penicillin-like compounds. It is a crude, desperate bioengineering born of trial and error. The emotional toll of this role is staggering. The women are the designated mourners. When the herbs fail, as they often do, it is the women who wash the body, wrap it in a scrap of clean linen, and oversee the hasty burial by the roadside. They are the processors of grief. They absorb the trauma of the group, weeping the tears that the warriors cannot afford to shed, so that the column can wake up the next morning and keep walking. As the sick recover and the wounded heal under this care, the bond within the group tightens. The refugees realize that their survival depends not just on the spear, but on the bowl of willow bark tea. The weaker sex is revealed to be the steel spine of the migration. However, as the health of the group stabilizes, a new shift in the atmosphere begins. The scouts return with disturbing reports. The road ahead is not empty. It is clogged with other groups, not just families, but armed bands, wagons of war, and men wearing the horned helmets of foreign tribes. The isolated streams of refugees are flowing into a great turbulent river of humanity. The floating village is about to lose its autonomy. They are drifting into the gravitational pull of a massive historical movement. The rumours speak of a great coalition forming, a swarm of peoples moving south with a single violent purpose. The family must now decide, do they remain a small vulnerable target, or do they merge with the gathering storm, trading their independence for the safety of the mob? And as they see the smoke of 1,000 campfires on the horizon, the question becomes, in the chaos of the Great Migration, is it safer to hide from the monster or to become part of it? The horizon ahead is no longer empty. It is obscured by a permanent choking brown haze that stretches from the foothills to the sea. The ground beneath the family's feet begins to vibrate, a low-frequency tremor that is felt in the teeth before it is heard. It is not an earthquake, it is the footfall of a nation. The family has reached the terminus of their solitary struggle. They are about to be swallowed by the event that defines the catastrophe of the Bronze Age, the movement of the Sea Peoples. History has long remembered the Sea Peoples as a terrifying, faceless wave of barbarians who swept down from the north to destroy civilization. But as our family crests the ridge and looks down upon the coastal plain, they do not see monsters. They see a mirror. They see thousands upon thousands of families just like their own, a chaotic patchwork of humanity welded together by the sheer gravity of desperation. This is the moment of assimilation. There is no formal greeting, no border control. The family simply walks down the slope and merges into the mass. It is a physical sensation of being absorbed. One moment, they are an isolated unit making their own decisions. The next, they are a single cell in a massive lumbering organism. They are no longer refugees, they are now part of the horde. The visual landscape of this host is a riot of cultures. We see the feathered headdresses of the Peliset, the biblical Philistines, the horned helmets of the Shurden, and the heavy woolen tunics of Anatolians. Languages clash and blend in the air, a cacophony of Greek, Luwian, and tongues that have no name today. Here we encounter the most significant piece of evidence that redefines the Sea Peoples from a military army to a migration: the ox cart. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict these invaders not just in warships, but in clumsy two-wheeled wooden carts pulled by oxen. These carts are filled not with loot, but with women, children, and household pottery. This mainstream historical fact changes everything. Soldiers do not bring their grandmothers to a war. These people are not on a raid, they are moving house. The family's donkey is tethered to the back of a creaking wain. The mother climbs aboard, sitting shoulder to shoulder with a woman from a city she has never heard of. They share a look of exhausted understanding. The camp followers are not an accessory to this army, they are the point of it. The warriors marching on the flanks are not fighting for glory, they are fighting to clear a path for these carts. For the father, the transformation is immediate and brutal. A man with a spear is no longer a father protecting his family, he is a recruit. He is pulled from the side of the cart and pushed into a marching column. He is surrounded by men who speak different languages, but share the same hard, starving look. He is handed a heavier shield, perhaps a round one in the style of the Shardana, and told to keep pace. This is where the hidden logic of the collapse reveals its darkest turn. To survive, the victim must become the aggressor. For weeks, the family feared the bandits. Now, by joining the swarm, they are the bandits. The logic of the horde is simple. The harvest ahead belongs to us because we are here and we are hungry. It is a terrifying shift in morality. The peaceful farmer from Pylos must now be willing to burn a village in the Levant to feed his children. The collapse has stripped away the luxury of empathy. Scholarly debate continues to rage over the agency of the Sea Peoples. Were they the cause of the collapse, smashing empires that were otherwise healthy? Or were they merely the symptoms, the flotsam of a disaster that had already happened? Walking inside the dust cloud, the answer feels like the latter. These people do not feel like conquerors. They feel like a landslide, a force of nature that has lost its footing and is sliding uncontrollably downhill, crushing everything in its path simply because it has nowhere else to go. There is a fascinating fringe detail regarding the branding of these warriors. Some historians suggest that as disparate groups merged, they adopted visual unifiers to distinguish friend from foe in the heat of battle. Our father might tie a specific bundle of reeds to his helmet, or paint a symbol on his shield that matches the clan he has been absorbed into. It is the ancient equivalent of a uniform, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaotic mob. The momentum of the migration is terrifying, is slow, grinding, and unstoppable. They strip the land like locusts. Every field they pass is harvested down to the root. Every well is drained dry. The scorched earth left behind is not always an act of war. Often it is just the byproduct of 10,000 bellies needing to be filled. As they move south, following the coast, the rumours ripple through the column like electricity. They are heading for the last light in the world. They are heading for the land where the river flows forever, where the granaries are mountains of stone, where the gold is as common as dust. They are heading for Egypt. The name Egypt is whispered with a mix of reverence and avarice. It is the impossible dream. It is the only empire left standing, the only place that can absorb this many people. The hope of the migration crystallizes into a single fanatical goal: reach the delta. But this hope is dangerous. It blinds them to the reality of what awaits. The father, marching in the dust, grips his spear. He is no longer just walking away from Pylos, he is marching toward a war. He does not know that the pharaoh Ramesses III knows they are coming. He does not know that the scribes in Thebes are already carving the victory inscriptions, describing this family not as desperate refugees, but as the 9 bows, the enemies of order who must be crushed. As the landscape shifts to the sandy, scrubby terrain of the Sinai approach, the floating village hardens into a battering ram. The songs around the campfire change. They are no longer mournful ballads of home, they are rhythmic, chanting war songs meant to psych up the men for the collision. The family is swept along, trapped in the current of history. They cannot stop. To stop is to be trampled or left behind to die. They can only move forward, toward the shimmering heat haze, where the great armies of the pharaoh are waiting. The question that hangs over the vast dust-choked column is no longer, will we survive the journey? It is a far bloodier question. When the irresistible force of the migration meets the immovable object of the Egyptian empire, who will be left standing in the red mud of the Nile? The smell hits them before the sight does. After weeks of breathing the dry, metallic dust of the Sinai and the salt spray of the coast, the air suddenly turns sweet, heavy and wet. It is the scent of black mud, rotting papyrus and life itself. They have reached the edges of the Nile Delta. To the eyes of the famished refugees, the horizon is no longer a shimmering void of heat. It is a vivid, hallucinated line of green. Palm trees, reeds and fields of emmer wheat stretch as far as the eye can see. This is the breadbasket of the ancient world, the engine that has hummed without interruption for 2,000 years. The psychological impact of this site cannot be overstated. For the family, this is not just a geographical border, it is the finish line of their suffering. They believe that if they can just cross that line of reeds, the hunger will stop. They imagine that the pharaoh, the god-king who controls the rising of the river, will have mercy. Surely in a land of such infinite abundance there is room for them. But as the massive, creaking column of ox carts and warriors pushes through the final stretch of scrub, the green horizon begins to glitter. It is not the sparkle of water, it is the reflection of the sun on thousands of bronze scales. Waiting for them, standing motionless in the tall grass, is the army of Ramesses III. We must understand the Egyptian perspective here to grasp the tragedy. The pharaoh is not seeing a humanitarian crisis, he is seeing an existential threat. The sea peoples have already burned Hattusa, Ugarit, and Ashkelon. If they enter the delta, they will eat Egypt alive. The logic of the empire is cold and absolute. To save the many inside, the few outside must die. The battle that follows, known to history as the Battle of the Delta, is not a contest of equals, it is an industrial slaughter. As the refugees surge forward, driven by the pressure of the crowd behind them, the sky turns black. This is the terror of the Egyptian military machine, the massed volley of the composite bow. Unlike the simple wooden self-bows of the refugees, the Egyptian weapon is a high-tech laminate of wood, horn, and sinew. It hits with the force of a sledgehammer and has a range that defies belief. The refugees are cut down long before they can even throw a spear. There is no glory here, no heroic duels. There is only the thwacking sound of arrows hitting flesh and the screaming of the oxen as the carts are turned into pincushions. The father, pressed into the front ranks with his shield, finds himself in a chaotic hellscape. The reeds, which looked so inviting from a distance, are a trap. The ground is soft mud, sucking at the ankles, neutralizing the charge. The Egyptians, fighting on their home turf, move easily on the levees. They herd the invaders like cattle. On the river, the scene is even worse. The Sea Peoples' ships, low and open-decked, are lured into the mouths of the Nile branches. There, the Egyptian navy traps them. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu depict this moment with gruesome clarity. Ships capsized, men tangled in nets, and soldiers spearing swimming refugees like fish in a barrel. It is a total crushing encirclement. From the vantage point of the mother, hiding in the cart near the rear, the battle is a wall of noise. She cannot see the river, but she can hear the distinct rhythmic roar of the Egyptian infantry as they advance. She sees the smoke rising where the lead carts have been set on fire. She realizes with a sickening jolt that the promised land is not a sanctuary. It is a fortress, and the gates are locked. There is a scholarly debate about the outcome of this battle that adds a layer of nuance to the family's fate. The inscriptions claim a total victory. I overthrew them, I slaughtered them in their places. Yet we know that Ramesses did not kill everyone. He couldn't. The migration was too large. Many historians argue that after the slaughter a deal was struck. The surviving warriors were branded and conscripted into the Egyptian army. The families were settled in buffer zones in Canaan to guard the very empire they tried to invade. But for our family, caught in the panicked rear guard, there is no deal. There is only the rout. The momentum of the Great Migration is broken. The wave hits the wall and shatters. The cry goes up, turn back, turn back. The retreat is more harrowing than the advance. The unified horde dissolves back into terrified individual family units. They scramble away from the green line, back into the blistering scrub. They leave behind the broken carts, the dead oxen, and the bodies of neighbours who thought they had made it. The father miraculously stumbles back to the cart, his shield gone, his eyes wild with the trauma of the arrow storm. They have lost everything in the shadow of the pyramids. The illusion that there was a place waiting for them is gone. The psychological anchor that pulled them across 1,000 miles of wilderness has been cut. They are adrift in the desert, unwanted by the earth. This moment creates a profound crisis of faith. In the Bronze Age, if you lost a war, it meant your gods had abandoned you. As the survivors huddle in the dunes that night, listening to the jackals feasting on the battlefield, they must grapple with a terrifying theological question. If the gods of the city are dead and the gods of Egypt are enemies, then who is left to hear their prayers? The rejection at the delta forces a grim new reality. They cannot go south, Egypt holds the line. They cannot go north, the land is stripped bare. They cannot go west, into the sea. The only direction left is up. They look toward the jagged, violet silhouette of the Canaanite highlands to the east. These are the hill country lands, rough, rocky, and historically ignored by the great powers because they were too difficult to farm and too poor to tax. It is a landscape of last resort. The mother looks at the dwindling sack of grain. She looks at the children, whose faces are thin and streaked with the dust of the retreat. She knows that the easy life of the plains is over forever. To survive now, they must do something radical. They must stop trying to find a city to live in, and learn to live in a place where no city can exist. They turn the donkey's head toward the hills. The dream of the palace is dead. The dream of the granary is dead. What lies ahead is a life of hard stone, deep silence, and a complete reinvention of what it means to be human. As they begin the slow, painful climb away from the lush green of the Nile and into the barren grey of the mountains, a daunting question settles on their shoulders. Can a people raised in the comfort of the valleys learn the harsh vertical discipline required to survive on the roof of the world? The retreat into the highlands is not a march, it is a climb. The family leaves the blood-soaked mud of the delta behind and ascends into a landscape that seems, at first glance, to be completely hostile to human life. The Canaanite highlands, the spine of the region, are a jagged chaos of limestone ridges, scrub oak, and deep, dry wadis. There are no broad rivers here to flood the fields with fertile silt. There are no convenient trade routes. It is a place of silence, wind, and rock. But to the refugees, this hostility is a gift. The great armies of the Bronze Age, the chariots of Egypt and the Hittites cannot operate here. The wheels that conquered the plains shatter on these slopes. The terrain itself acts as a filter. Only the desperate and the determined can enter. By moving up, the family has finally moved out of reach of the empires that tried to kill them. They find a small saddle of land between two peaks, a place where the wind is blocked by a cliff face. Here they stop. They unhitch the donkey for the last time. The animal, ribs showing through its dusty coat, grazes on a patch of thyme. The father drives his spear into the ground, not as a weapon, but as a marker. They are not walking anymore. The first task is not to plant, but to clear. The hill country is choked with stones. To clear a field here is a labour of Herculean patience. We watch the family engage in the back-breaking work of destoning. They pry rocks from the earth with calloused hands, piling them into low walls. These walls serve a dual purpose. They mark the boundary of the new farm and they create terraces. This is the hidden engineering genius of the Highlands. By building stepped terraces up the side of the mountain, they create flat land where none existed. They turn the liability of the slope into an asset, trapping the soil and the rainwater. It is a slow generational investment. You do not build a terrace for next year's harvest, you build it for your grandchildren. But the most critical technology they deploy is invisible from the surface. In the plains, they drank from rivers. Here, there is no water source. They must catch the sky. They dig deep bell-shaped pits into the bedrock cisterns, but limestone is porous, water leaks out as fast as it pours in. Here we find a specific game-changing innovation: slaked lime plaster. By burning limestone and mixing it with water, they create a waterproof sealant. They coat the inside of the cisterns, creating a bottle in the rock that can hold the winter rains through the long, baking summer. This simple chemical trick is the key that unlocks the mountains. Without it, settlement here would be impossible. The architecture of their new home reflects their changed reality. They do not build palaces or sprawling villas. They build what archaeologists call the four-room house, or the pillared house. It is a humble, practical design, a central courtyard for animals and work surrounded by 3 pillared bays for sleeping and storage. It is built of rough field stones, not cut ashlar blocks. Inside this house, the life of the woman undergoes a brutal transformation. In the palace economy, she might have been a specialized weaver or a potter. Here, she must be everything. But her primary burden, the one that defines her existence, is the daily grind. Grain in these hills must be processed by hand on a saddle quern, a large concave stone. The woman kneels before it, pushing a smaller rubbing stone back and forth, crushing the wheat kernels. It is a motion that requires the entire upper body. We know the toll this took because the bones tell us. Bioarchaeologists studying skeletons from these highland settlements have found a distinctive pattern of wear on the female bones: arthritic knees, damaged toes from hours of kneeling, and massive upper arm strength. These women were physically reshaping their bodies to feed their families. The rhythmic scrape, scrape, scrape of the quern becomes the heartbeat of the village, a sound that starts before dawn and does not stop until dusk. It is a sound of survival, heavy and monotonous. Yet there is a fierce dignity in this hardship. In the Highlands, there are no tax collectors, there are no overseers with whips, the family keeps what they grow. We are witnessing the birth of an egalitarian society. The archaeological record shows a lack of prestige goods in these villages. There are no imported gems, no gold masks, no grand temples. Everyone lives in a house of roughly the same size. Everyone eats from the same simple bowls. Scholars debate the identity of these settlers intensely. Are they the Habru, the renegades and outlaws mentioned in the Amarna letters? Are they displaced Canaanites? Are they the Shasu nomads settling down? Or are they the earliest Israelites forging a new identity in the hills? The pottery suggests a mix. It seems that the Highlands became a melting pot, a refuge where the refugees of the collapse, Mycenaeans, Canaanites, Sea Peoples, blended together, stripping away their old labels to become simply farmers. The social structure shifts from a monarchy to a tribal confederacy. Problems are solved by the elders at the gate, council of heads of households. It is a rough democracy born of necessity. If a terrace wall collapses, the whole village rebuilds it. If a cistern leaks, the neighbours share their water. The palace economy of redistribution is replaced by a moral economy of mutual aid. As the seasons turn, the hills begin to change colour. The grey slopes are softened by the silver green of olive trees and the bright green of grapevines. These are crops that love the rocky soil. The family presses their own oil and stomps their own wine. The taste is sharper, wilder than the smooth vintages of the coast, but it tastes of freedom. The father, once a soft-handed citizen of Pylos, now has hands like leather. He knows the microclimate of his valley, which way the wind blows, where the frost settles. He has forgotten the etiquette of the court, but he has learned the language of the sky. But in this rugged isolation, something precious is slipping away. The struggle for calories is so all-consuming that there is no time for the luxuries of the mind. The intricate bureaucracy of the Bronze Age, the recording of history, the poetry of the scribes, all of this requires a surplus of food and time that the hills do not provide. As the grandfather sits by the fire, trying to teach his grandson the complex shapes of the linear B script or the cuneiform wedges, he sees the boy's eyes glazing over. The boy knows how to shear a sheep and how to plaster a cistern. He does not see the use of scratching marks into clay. The old man realizes with a heavy heart that the chain of knowledge is breaking. The survival of the body is demanding the sacrifice of the intellect. As the fire dies down, casting long, flickering shadows on the rough stone walls, a quiet tragedy unfolds. How much of their history, their art, and their soul must they forget simply to ensure that their children live to see the sunrise? The most haunting sound of the Bronze Age collapse is not the clash of swords or the roar of flames. It is the silence that follows. For centuries, the palaces of the Mediterranean hummed with the voice of administration. In the archives of Pylos, Knossos, and Ugarit, thousands of scribes spent their days scratching lists into damp clay, recording every sheep, every jar of oil, and every chariot wheel in the kingdom. It was a civilization built on data, but up here in the rugged isolation of the highlands, that voice has been strangled. We are witnessing one of the greatest tragedies in the human story, the erasure of the written word. In the dim light of the stone house, the grandfather, perhaps the last survivor of the generation that knew the old life, sits by the fire. His hands, now gnarled from gripping a hoe, fumble with a small lump of river clay. He smooths it out, his thumb finding the old familiar rhythm. He reaches for a sharp stick, intending to fashion a stylus. He wants to teach his grandson the symbols of Linna B. He wants to show the boy how to write the word for freedom, or king, or history. But the boy, tired from a day of hauling stones for the terrace walls, watches with a mix of boredom and confusion. To him, the clay is not a canvas for ideas. It is material for a pot or a seal for a leaking roof. The symbols the old man scratches, complex, spiky sillograms that represent sounds rather than ideas, look like bird tracks in the mud. They are meaningless. This is the brutal reality of the Dark Age. Writing in the Bronze Age was not a skill for the masses. It was a specialized technology of the elite, a trade secret guarded by a guild of professional scribes. It was designed for accounting, not for poetry. It was the tool of the tax collector, the overseer, and the general. When the palaces burned, the guild was shattered. The scribes were killed or scattered. And without the palace economy, the massive system of collecting and redistributing goods, there was simply no need to write anything down. A farmer in the hills does not need a spreadsheet to know he has 3 goats. He knows them by name. He does not need a treaty to know his neighbour's boundary. He knows it by the stone wall they built together. There is a profound, almost philosophical irony here. To the refugees, writing was not a gift of civilization. It was the chain that bound them to it. Those clay tablets were the records of their debts, their conscription orders, their taxes. In a way, the forgetting of the script is not an accident. It is a subconscious act of liberation. By letting the writing die, they are erasing the evidence of who owned them. We see a fascinating fringe behaviour in the archaeological record that supports this. In some abandoned citadels, tablets were found baked hard, not by a kiln, but by the accidental fires that destroyed the archives. But in the resettlement layers above, we find no attempt to replicate them. Instead, we sometimes find these baked tablets reused as building rubble, or worse, ground up to make temper for cheap pottery. The words of the kings are literally being trodden underfoot, turned into the mud bricks of a peasant's hovel. Scholars still debate the perishable media theory. Did writing truly vanish, or did it just migrate to materials that history couldn't preserve? Some argue that the refugees might have written on wooden boards covered in wax, or on papyrus scrolls brought from Egypt. If so, those words rotted away in the damp winters of the highlands, leaving us with the illusion of silence. But the consensus leans toward a true loss. The complexity of Linear B required constant practice. Once the schools closed, the knowledge evaporated within a single generation. However, as the written word fades, the role of women as the keepers of memory becomes paramount. The intellect of the society shifts from the archive to the hearth. While the men are forced to focus on the immediate grinding physics of survival, stone, soil, sweat, the women take up the burden of cultural continuity. They do not use clay, they use the loom. Watch the grandmother in the corner of the room. Her eyes are failing, but her fingers are sure. As she weaves the wool, she incorporates patterns, zigzags, waves, stylized figures that are not merely decorative. They are mnemonic devices. A specific weave pattern might represent the crossing of the sea. Another might symbolize the burning of the city. She sings as she works, a low, rhythmic chant. These are not the dry lists of the scribes. They are the seeds of the epic cycles. She tells the story of the Great War at Troy, of the heroes who wandered for 10 years, of the anger of the gods. The grandson stops looking at the clay and turns to listen to the song. The rhythm catches in his mind. He can remember the song. He cannot remember the scratchings. In this transition, history stops being a rigid record of facts and becomes a fluid living mythology. The precise date of the fall of Pylos is lost, but the feeling of the fall is preserved forever in the meter of the verse. The women are constructing the oral tradition that will eventually, centuries later, be dictated to a new breed of scribe to create the Iliad and the Odyssey. The grandfather looks at the boy, then at the clay in his hand. He realizes the battle is lost. The complexity of the palace world has no place here in the subsistence of the hills. The abstract must give way to the concrete. He sighs, a sound like dry leaves scraping together, and drops the clay. He does not smooth it over. He lets it fall into the dust of the floor. The stylus, the instrument of high civilization, is tossed into the fire. It burns with a brief, bright flame and then turns to ash. The link is broken. The family has entered the time of forgetting. For the next 300 years, Greece will be illiterate. The great thoughts, the complex diplomatic treaties, the royal decrees, all will vanish into the dark. But in exchange, the people have gained a hard, simplistic clarity. They are no longer cogs in a machine they cannot control. They are masters of their own small, rocky domains. But nature abhors a vacuum. As the soft intellectual tools of the Bronze Age rot away, the refugees find themselves needing something else to conquer the unforgiving landscape. The bronze tools they carried from the city are wearing out. The copper edges are dull and the tin trade routes are dead. They cannot repair them. They need a new material, something harder, uglier, and more abundant than the golden metal of the past. As the grandfather closes his eyes, leaving the boy to a world without letters, a new sound begins to ring out from the smithy in the valley below. It is not the dull thud of bronze casting, but the high, ringing clang of a hammer striking a strange grey sponge of metal that will change the destiny of the human species. Necessity is a cruel master, but it is also the mother of the most profound inventions. As the years of isolation in the highlands stretch into decades, the refugees face a crisis that threatens to undo all their hard work. The problem is material. The bronze tools they brought from the coast, the axes that clear the forest, the picks that carve the cisterns, the ploughshares that turn the rocky soil are dying. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. Copper is common enough, found in the hills of Cyprus and the Levant, but tin is the rare spice of the metallurgical world, brought from the far edges of the earth, from Afghanistan or Cornwall. When the trade routes collapsed, the supply of tin was cut off instantly. The blacksmith in the village can no longer cast new bronze. He can only recycle the old, melting down a broken dagger to make a smaller, weaker knife. The metal becomes brittle, the edges dull. The community is slowly disarming itself against the wild. In the smoky darkness of the village smithy, a structure built of rough stones away from the houses to prevent fire, the blacksmith fights a losing battle. He is a man of the borderlands, often feared for his ability to manipulate fire and earth. He knows that without metal, his people will slide back into the Stone Age. He looks at the piles of useless reddish rock that litter the hillsides, the bloodstones that farmers curse because they dull the wooden ploughs. This is iron ore. The ancients knew of iron, but they largely ignored it. It was considered an inferior, dirty metal, difficult to work and lacking the golden lustre of bronze. Meteoritic iron, fallen from the sky, was worshipped as a gift from the gods, but terrestrial iron was just heavy dirt. However, hunger changes the definition of value. Driven by the desperate lack of tin, the blacksmith decides to try the impossible. He gathers the red rocks, but he cannot treat them like copper. If you put copper in the fire, it melts into a beautiful, obedient liquid that can be poured into a mould. Iron is stubborn, it refuses to melt. To work it, the smith must build a hotter fire than anyone has ever seen. This is where the silent partners of the Iron Age step in. To reach the melting point of iron, over 1,500 degrees Celsius, requires an immense amount of fuel. It requires charcoal, not just wood. The production of charcoal is a slow, dirty, dangerous process of burning wood in oxygen-starved mounds. In the division of labour of the new village, this task often falls to the women and children. They spend days tending the smouldering piles in the forest, their faces blackened with soot, ensuring the wood cooks but does not burn. Without their relentless production of fuel, the blacksmith's forge is cold. With the charcoal piled high, the smith builds a bloomery, a chimney of clay. He pumps the bellows until his lungs burn, forcing air into the heart of the fire. The heat becomes blinding. Yet when he breaks open the furnace, he does not find a puddle of liquid metal. He finds a bloom, a sponge-like ugly lump of glowing slag and iron. To a Bronze Age smith, this looks like failure, but necessity forces him to go further. He takes the glowing sponge to the anvil and begins to hammer it. This is the fundamental shift. Bronze is cast, iron is wrought. The rhythm of the village changes from the gentle pouring of moulds to the violent, ringing percussion of hammer on metal. He beats the impurities out of the stone, folding the metal over and over again, sweating in the infernal heat. The result is a grey, dull-looking blade. It pits easily. It rusts if you look at it wrong. In the beginning, it is actually softer than high-quality bronze. A bronze sword could slice through these early iron weapons. Mainstream history often ignores this fact. The Iron Age didn't start because iron was better. It started because it was available. It was the plywood of the ancient world, cheap, ugly, and everywhere. But then, a happy accident occurs. As the smith hammers the iron in the bed of glowing charcoal, trace amounts of carbon migrate from the fire into the metal. Without understanding the chemistry, he is performing carburization. He is turning soft iron into steel. When he quenches the blade in a bucket of water, perhaps in a fit of frustration, the sudden cooling freezes the crystal structure. The next day, he takes the blade to the grindstone. He finds that it holds an edge unlike anything he has ever seen. It can bite into the oak tree without dulling. It can shatter a limestone rock. He has created a tool that matches the hardness of the landscape. The introduction of this ugly metal changes the political landscape forever. Bronze was an aristocratic metal. Because the ingredients were rare and imported, the kings controlled the supply. If the king didn't want you to have a sword, you didn't have one. Bronze enforced hierarchy. Iron is the metal of democracy. The ore is in every swamp, every mountain range, every riverbed. You do not need a king to get it. You do not need a trade fleet. You only need a strong arm and a forest to burn. Suddenly, every village can arm itself. Every farmer can have an iron tip on his plough. The palace monopoly is smashed by the geology of the earth itself. We see the immediate impact in the fields. The iron ploughshare, heavy, sharp and durable, can cut deeper into the heavy clay soils that wooden or bronze ploughs couldn't touch. This allows the refugees to farm land that was previously considered useless. They can clear the dense pine forests of the highlands with iron axes that don't chip. The carrying capacity of the land explodes. This is the hidden engine of the recovery. Iron allows the population to grow. It allows the villages to expand. It turns the hill country from a refuge of starvation into a thriving network of terraced farms. But there is a darker side to this discovery. If a plough can be made cheaply, so can a spear. The democratization of war begins. In the Bronze Age, battles were decided by a few elite warriors in expensive chariots. Now, a village can field 100 men armed with iron. The scale of violence expands. The conflicts become bloodier, grittier. We move from the age of the duel to the age of the infantry phalanx. There is a fascinating fringe theory regarding the Philistine monopoly. The Bible speaks of the Philistines, the Peleset of the sea peoples, forbidding the Israelites from having blacksmiths, forcing them to come down to the coast to sharpen their tools. This was likely an attempt to put the genie back in the bottle, to impose a Bronze Age style control on an Iron Age technology. It failed. The secret was too simple. You cannot hide a technology that requires only dirt and fire. As the blacksmith holds up the finished product, a simple grey adze, he wipes the sweat from his eyes. He is not a priest or a scribe, he is a dirty, exhausted labourer. But he has done what the pharaohs could not. He has given his people a future that is self-reliant. The tool is passed to the farmer who weighs it in his hand. It feels different, heavier, deadlier. It lacks the soul of the bronze, the singing quality of the copper alloy. It is a cold, indifferent material. But when he swings it at the hard earth, it bites deep, turning up the dark, fertile soil that has been hiding beneath the crust for centuries. The village has survived the collapse. They have survived the migration. They have survived the hunger. Now, with iron in their hands, they are ready to stop merely surviving and start building. The Dark Age is ending, not with a flash of light, but with the ringing of a hammer in the dawn. But as the sun rises over the terraced hills, illuminating a landscape that has been tamed by this new grey metal, the people must ask themselves one final, quiet question. They have conquered the wilderness and forged a new way of life, but are they still the same people who walked out of the golden palaces? Or has the iron they forged also hardened their own souls into something unrecognizable? The terror of the collapse does not end with a treaty or a parade. It ends with the quiet, unremarkable return of the sunrise over a valley that is no longer burning. It is now roughly 1000 BC. The great fires that consumed the palaces of Pylos and Ugrit have been cold for nearly 2 centuries. The generation that ran from the Sea Peoples is gone, and their children's children now walk the earth. The panic of the migration has settled into the deep, rhythmic breathing of a new stability. The landscape has healed. The forests, once stripped for charcoal and ramparts, have grown back, covering the scars of the old wars with a blanket of green. The village in the highlands is no longer a refugee camp. It is a home. The rough stone walls of the houses have settled into the earth, covered in vines. The terraces, built with such agonizing labour by the first generation, are now ancient features of the mountain, holding the soil firm against the winter rains. We are witnessing the end of the so-called Dark Age. For Victorian historians, this era was a black hole of culture, a time of poverty and ignorance. But looking closer, through the lens of the family that survived, we see that it was not an age of darkness, it was an age of incubation. Like a field left fallow to recover its nutrients, the human spirit was resting, shedding the heavy, suffocating bureaucracy of the palaces to rediscover the simplicity of the tribe. The political world has shrunk, but it has also become more human. The distant godlike Wanax, the high king who ruled from a throne room he never left, is a forgotten ghost. In his place stands the basileus. In the Bronze Age, this word meant a minor official or a foreman. Now it means chieftain or king, but this new king is not a tyrant. He lives in a house only slightly larger than his neighbours. He ploughs his own field. He eats at the same communal table. He cannot tax his people into starvation because he has no army to enforce it. He rules by consensus, by the respect of the elders, and by his ability to resolve disputes in the village square. We are seeing the embryonic form of the polis, the Greek city-state. The democracy of the Iron Age is beginning to take root in the rocky soil. In the pottery workshops, a new aesthetic is emerging that speaks volumes about the mindset of these survivors. The wild, flowing marine scenes of the Minoans, the octopuses and dancing dolphins, are gone. In their place we find proto-geometric art. The potters are using compasses and multiple brushes to paint perfect concentric circles, rigid bands of black and glaze, and precise triangles. This is not a loss of creativity, it is a psychological defense mechanism. In a world that was recently torn apart by chaos, the human mind craves order. These geometric shapes are a way of imposing logic on the universe. They are saying the world may be wild, but on this jar everything is under control, everything has a place. It is the art of a people who value stability above all else. The role of women has solidified into the bedrock of this society. The panic of the flight has been replaced by the authority of the household. The oikos, the family unit, is now the supreme sovereign state. There is no palace to distribute grain, so the mother's management of the storeroom is the only economy that matters. Her loom is the factory, her hearth is the temple. The independence they forged on the road has become a cultural norm. They are the partners of the basileus, not merely his subjects. Religion, too, has come down from the mountain peaks. The great temples are ruins haunted by owls. Worship now happens in open-air sanctuaries, in sacred groves, or at simple altars in the courtyard. The gods have changed. The terrifying distant deities of the Bronze Age are evolving into the familiar, bickering, human-like family of the Olympians. They are gods who understand struggle, gods who can be bargained with. The continuity of faith has survived, but it has been democratized. There is a fascinating scholarly debate regarding the Dorian invasion. Ancient Greek legends claim that a new tribe, the Dorians, descended from the north to conquer the land. For a long time, historians believed this was the final wave of the collapse. But modern archaeology tells a gentler story. There is no layer of ash associated with the Dorians. It seems they didn't conquer the survivors. They were the survivors. The dialect shifts and cultural changes were likely internal, a slow evolution of the people reinventing themselves rather than a foreign imposition. The invaders were just the children of the refugees, speaking a new way. As the sun climbs higher, the village is busy. The sound of the iron hammer rings from the smithy, a sound of creation, not war. A merchant leads a mule train up the valley path. Trade is returning. It is tentative, small scale, iron for wine, olive oil for wool, but the arteries of the Mediterranean are opening again. The isolation is ending. The grandfather, the one who tried to teach the script, is long dead. His grave is marked by a simple cairn on the hillside. The people have forgotten the specific names of the kings who ruled Pylos. They have forgotten the complex tax codes and the names of the sea raiders. But they have remembered what matters. They remember the story of the Great War. They remember the heroes who sailed the dark seas. These memories are no longer history. They are myth. In the evenings, the bard strikes his lyre, a new instrument, lighter and more versatile, and sings the lines that will one day be written down as the works of Homer. The trauma of the collapse has been transmuted into art. The Golden Age is looked back upon not as a real historical period, but as a dream time when men walked with gods. They do not realize that they are the ones building the true foundation of the West. They do not know that the humble iron tools in their hands and the rough assemblies in their squares will lead to the Parthenon, to philosophy, to science. They are simply living. They are the survivors who refused to lay down and die when the world ended. They are the proof that civilization is not built of stone walls or gold masks. It is built of something far more durable, the stubborn, irrational, unyielding will of the family to keep the fire lit for one more night. The storm of the Bronze Age collapse has finally blown itself out. The sky is clear, the olive trees are silver in the wind, and down in the valley a child laughs, a sound that carries no memory of the terror, only the promise of the future. The long night is over, the new day has begun, and so we leave them there, safe in the embrace of the high valleys. The long, dusty road that led them from the burning palaces to the quiet safety of the hills has finally reached its end. The heavy packs have been set down. The sandals, worn thin by the miles of uncertainty, are placed by the door. The struggle of the journey has faded into the peaceful rhythm of the seasons, the sowing of the seed, the gathering of the olives, the pressing of the oil. The fire in the hearth burns low, casting a warm amber glow across the room, softening the hard edges of the stone walls. The work of the day is done. The iron tools rest in the corner, silent and still. The loom is quiet. The anxieties that once ruled the horizon, the fear of the empty granary, the dread of the unknown sail, have dissolved into the comfort of the familiar. Outside, the wind whispers through the pine trees, a gentle hushing sound that wraps around the house like a protective blanket. The stars, the same stars that guided them through the wilderness, now look down on a world at peace. They are no longer the cold, indifferent lights of the desert, but the watchful guardians of a sleeping village. History will continue its march with its rise and fall of empires, its noise and its fury. But for now, in this small, hidden pocket of time, there is only the stillness of rest. The world has taken a deep breath. The weight of the past has been lifted. Drift away from the ancient hills, floating softly back through the layers of time, carrying with you the resilience and the quiet strength of those who walked before. The fire is warm, the door is barred, the night is safe, sweet dreams.